On today's 7th Circle Gaming, we analyze Warhammer Chaosbane. And we're going to begin in our usual manner with the full disclosure. And as always, pause the video or just sit back and wait for the screenshots. And the first screenshot that we have to share with you is illustrative of what the game world in and of itself looks like. And it's also meant to illustrate the user interface. What we're seeing for the user interface is largely centered on the lower left and the top right corners of the screen. However, most players are going to be paying attention to the lower left more than the mini-map on the top right, because on the lower left are going to be the health points indicator and the mana indicator and all of the other sort of cooldown timers. Moving on now to our second screenshot. Obviously, as we would expect from any sort of role-playing game, inventory management and managing kit or equipment is going to be a major part of the game. It's also where we find the first statistics mentioned in the game. All of those items, be they armor or weapons, have statistics attached to them for players to compare and contrast with what they are currently wearing, to determine whether or not they represent an increase or a decrease in their combat abilities or their time to kill. That's a little bit of a hint for those who are very familiar with the genre. Moving right along to the second skill tree that players are going to be interacting with, or the second upgrade path that players can interact with, rather. This is the direct skill tree where players are going to be purchasing their skills, their combat abilities, in other words, with action points, which are displayed on the bottom left of the screen. Some of these will unlock as players progress through the game. Others the player can start out with each character with. Moving on now to the second of the unlockable skill trees, for want of a better phrase. This the game calls the God skill tree. However, what it really functions as is an additional bonus for a specific trait, be it health or critical damage or attack speed, something like that. Moving on to our final screenshot is the overworld interaction. Now, the game calls this T-porting in between the different hub worlds. However, in a realistic sense, this really is where the player is going to have interactions with the different deities in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. And with that, we'll move on to our first chapter proper, which as always is Immersion. Here, Chaosbane has earned a 6.5 out of 15. The game will be, of course, using presentation to get players invested into the game world. The game is presented in a zoomable isometric view, and it seems fairly accurate to the Warhammer Fantasy setting. The game will also be using statistics focus to get players invested into the game world, as we alluded to earlier with all of that about the skill trees and inventory management. Fairly typical for a role-playing game. Now, the game will also be attempting to utilize player agency to get players invested into its world, in the sense that the players have multiple characters to select from with different abilities and health point pools, different attributes. Now, players will also be given, as you saw earlier in all of those screenshots, several different upgrade paths to invest their action skill points in. Players will also be given a limited amount of appearance options. Little explanation on that point is, while the player can select a specific armor piece from their inventory, and that will be represented on the character model, the player can also choose to use a specific piece as an appearance set, which will take precedence over any of the kit that the player has selected in their inventory. So if a player particularly likes a helmet or a pair of boots, or the look of an axe or sword, the player can select that as their appearance armor, for want of a better phrase. The game will also be attempting to utilize challenge to get players invested into the game world, fairly typical for the genre, in that the player will be combating mobs of enemies while managing both their health and mana pools. Finally, the game will also try to use story to get players invested into the game world, although this is a very light touch. So we don't include it in this list because obviously as the player tries different characters and replays the game, possibly that's going to really play much less of a role than it does their first time through. And speaking of that, and actually playing the game, let's move on to difficulty. And here Chaosbane is earning a 6 out of 15. The game can be played reasonably well with a gamepad or keyboard or mouse, and for that reason that's getting the majority of this credit. The game only has basic difficulty options, and the effects of those options are not described in overly helpful ways, we have to be honest. For example, one of the items that the player will notice as they select different difficulty options is the loot quality. And that really doesn't give the player much information about whether their damage level or the enemy health is going to increase or decrease. So there's obviously a fair amount of hidden statistics to discover as the player plays through the game. With several different characters with different attributes and different weapon choices, it's very likely that character choice will influence their difficulty. Say a character that is primarily melee focused and lacks any sort of ranged weapon is going to be somewhat more difficult to use or play through the game with than a character that is primarily ranged focused, or a character that has a large amount of area of effect attacks. The user interface, as we saw earlier, is not overly complicated. However, what we did notice from all of our evaluation sessions is that particularly keyboard players may find themselves accidentally tapping hotkeys or clicking on menu items when they didn't intend to do that. So just something to be aware of. But on that note, we're going to move on to lasting appeal. And here, Chaosbane is earning a 5 out of 15. While there are several characters to choose from with different attributes, makes it a significantly different experience. And there are two long or substantive story campaigns to select from, although we don't necessarily recommend switching in between. Players should really devote themselves to playing through one campaign and then moving on to the later one. Players can choose to retry the game on different difficulty levels. The game even provides them with the option of a permadeath character. The quests, from what we found, take anywhere from 9 minutes to 30 minutes to complete. There will be several repeat visits to an area. However, the objectives on that particular area are going to differ, be it rescuing a set number of prisoners, destroying a set number of objects, or simply defeating the boss of that particular area. Now, the game does, from what we found, it seemed to expect long play sessions of several hours or more, although it is completely possible to play through one quest and then quit and come back to it later. And speaking of coming back to it later, let's now compile everything into the overall score. Overall, Warhammer Chaosbane has earned a 5.83 out of 15. It gains a significant amount from the Warhammer license. However, is it absolutely essential to be a lore master of the old world to enjoy the game? We certainly don't think so. However, it does benefit the player to have something of an idea of what they're going to be interacting with. That's going to affect their enjoyment of the game. Is it going to be the ideal introduction to the Warhammer fantasy world? Not necessarily. However, the game does benefit in that all of its in-game species are fairly familiar. Elves, dwarves, humans, that sort of thing. Which is the long way of saying that being a lore master of the Warhammer fantasy or Warhammer old world is not essential, as we said earlier. That the game works with a gamepad or keyboard and mouse is somewhat unusual for the genre, so that's another point in the game's favor. There is a substantial amount of content included for free, so another point in the game's favor. However, and with a highly subjective caveat here, so grains of salt, both shoulders and all that, the game does get a bit repetitive with all of the repeat visits to the same area, even if the objectives are different, or the character that the player is playing through that mission or quest with, the game does get repetitive. And with that, we won't take up any more of your time there, because there isn't anything else to say about Warhammer Chaosbane. So, thanks very much for watching. We look forward to seeing you on our next review, and from 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye.